a president under fire, a region on the brink of war.
And a $100 million heist shaking the world. Is this conflict or diplomacy?
Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at a global chessboard today where it feels like every single piece is moving at once. It's February 25th, 2026, and from Washington to Tehran, pretty much the whole world is holding its breath. So you've got the President of the United States trying to juggle domestic priorities while at the same time dealing with some really explosive international pressure. Then you have this major standoff between world powers that's just getting hotter and hotter, and it's threatening to pull an entire region into a real, actual conflict. And get this, a story that honestly sounds like it's straight out of a movie. One of Europe's most famous landmarks is just reeling from a massive 9-figure theft. So, what's the thread connecting a presidency, a powder keg, and a palace heist? Well, let's find out. So let's kick things off in Washington, D.C., because right now it's really acting as the balancing point, the fulcrum, for a lot of this global tension. The moves being made there, they're sending ripples thousands of miles away. Now this is where it gets really interesting. If you watched President Trump's State of the Union, it was all about what's happening at home, right? A huge focus on domestic issues, especially immigration. But behind the scenes, a completely different, much more aggressive international game is being played. The administration is pushing hard to hike trade tariffs up to 15%. And that kind of move, that would be a huge shakeup for global economic policy. And that aggressive stance isn't just about money and trade. Nope. It's also fueling what is basically a powder keg situation in the Middle East. And all eyes are on Iran. Tensions are just at a fever pitch. Inside Iran, you're seeing anti-government protests sparking up all over again. Students are clashing with security forces in the streets. And as a big precaution, the U.S. has started pulling non-essential embassy staff out of nearby Beirut. That's a really clear signal they think a direct confrontation is possible. And sure, there's some talk about a diplomatic off-ramp in Geneva, but the very real threat of U.S. military strikes is just hanging over everything. And this quote right here, it really shows you the tug-of-war happening inside the administration. You have voices of caution. A military advisor reportedly told the president point blank that a full-scale war would come with significant costs and substantial risks. But that warning was met with a very different tone. President Trump's reported comeback was, well, unmistakable. The idea that his team is against a necessary move is, in his words, 100% incorrect. He's basically broadcasting that every single option is on the table to protect American interests. And Iran's response to all this? A crystal clear warning. Their foreign affairs spokesman has put it out there. Any attack from the U.S. would be seen as an act of aggression, and it would prompt a response. The lines are definitely being drawn in the sand. All right, let's pivot now. We're hopping over to Europe, where you see these two totally different crises playing out. One is a shocking, brand new scandal, and the other, a grim, grinding tragedy. First, that scandal. $100 million. I mean, just think about that number. That's the mind-boggling value of the French crown jewels, which were stolen from the Louvre back in October. The whole thing was so audacious, the fallout so big, it's now forced the museum's president to resign. So while that crisis has Paris completely gripped, a far deadlier one is marking a very grim anniversary. It has now been 5 years, since the full-scale war in Ukraine kicked off. What began as an invasion has just sunk into this brutal, grinding war of attrition. And today, even as the is begging for diplomacy, Russian air attacks just keep coming, knocking out power for millions of civilians over and over again. The human cost is just immense. The UN's Rosemary DiCarlo really captured how so many people feel, calling the war a stain on our collective conscience. She's pleading for the world to use literally every diplomatic tool it has to bring this fight to an end. Now, these huge flashpoints in Washington, Tehran, and Ukraine, they aren't happening in a bubble. So let's do a quick lightning round and see how the ripple effects are being felt all across the wider world. Okay, remember those U.S. tariff threats we talked about? Well, just to the north, Canada is hitting back. They're pumping $500 million into their forestry sector to protect it from what they are calling unjust U.S. trade measures. An economic defense is clearly being built. Meanwhile, in Africa, leaders have their eyes on a very different kind of future. They're all gathered at the Green Economy Summit, trying to lock down over $3 billion in climate finance. They're really looking to turn talk into real, on-the-ground action. And what's the official line from Moscow? Well, it's pretty consistent. Russia maintains it's involved in peacemaking efforts in Ukraine, and they're placing the blame for the war dragging on squarely on the shoulders of Western intervention. And then in South America, a totally different kind of crisis. Brazil is just grappling with a heartbreaking natural disaster. Rescue crews are out there searching for the missing after record-breaking rains and landslides have tragically taken at least 30 lives. So, when you pull all of these different threads together, the trade disputes, the drums of war, the incredible heists, the climate summits, you really start to see a world being pulled in so many different directions at once. And it all kind of boils down to one huge defining question for this year. In the middle of all this, with rising trade wars, the looming threat of actual military conflict, and seeing these long-standing institutions begin to decay, what path do we actually choose? Is it going to be diplomacy that guides us through the rest of this year? Or is it going to be division that ultimately writes our future? That's really the question on the table as all these stories keep unfolding.